The way we deal with death and celebrate a life has drastically changed in 2020. The COVID 19 pandemic has forced Americans and businesses in the so called death care industry to do things differently. For the large part, funeral directors can no longer comfort clients in person and arrange an intimate space for the family to grieve. Elaborate funerals with lengthy services and open casket viewings simply are not possible. No singing or chanting indoors is allowed. Instead, an outdoor service with a smaller number of guests is the new normal. Some families have even opted for virtual funerals on platforms like Zoom, where guests from across the country who can't fly in can still join. Each of the more than 19,000 funeral homes in the U.S. have faced many challenges this year. This includes a shift towards many more Americans choosing to be cremated since traditional services can't happen, accelerating a trend that was already growing over the last 5 years. The National Funeral Directors Association reported an uptick year over year in the number of people opting for cremation, with the preference gaining a majority in 2016.
You could go back, I guess, to the beginning of time, and there were some cremations, but cremations really here started becoming an idea and a thought in the 60s. And then it took off more in the 80s.
That's John Keith, co-owner of Keith Monument, based in Kentucky. The family-owned company was started in 1867 by Keith's great-grandfather. He founded the business in the small river town of Cloverport and would get the heavy stone monuments delivered by riverboat. Since then, the business has been passed down through generations.
When I was a teenager in the summers, I worked over in the monument company to learn the parts from, we call it underground up, digging graves or digging foundations, and then learning how to cut stencil and chisel in granite and do all of the things that have been done for centuries.
Over the last decade, the family has expanded the venture to operate one funeral home and a few cemeteries. In a normal year, Keith Monument produces around 3,000 to 4,000 stone monuments, markers, and memorials that are shipped to cemeteries across the region. Keith points out that many cemeteries are also expanding to different areas as space becomes the limiting factor.
Some of your older cemeteries are basically filled. There's a few lots left on old family lots, but there are no new area that they can buy to enlarge their cemeteries. But there are new cemeteries that are being started all the time. It's just that they're not starting those cemeteries in the middle of a city like the old cemeteries were. Now, as time has gone and those cemeteries have gotten to have less room, the new cemeteries that have been started have been out in the suburbs, and quickly the suburbs are becoming part of the city now, but they bought enough land that they've got land for the next 150 years.
In the end, he says it really comes down to personal preference, whether a person chooses to be buried in a cemetery or cremated. Another growing trend has been green burials, where the body is not embalmed and there are no caskets or concrete vaults.
Every state is different. If you go out to the West Coast today, 80 to 85% of all deaths are being cremation. In what I call the Bible Belt, where we are basically, we're getting close to 50%. And it's just a matter of personal choice of what a person wants.
By 2040, the National Funeral Directors Association projects that nearly 80% of people in the U.S. will choose to be cremated rather than buried. This drastic shift towards cremation in the U.S. can be attributed to a number of factors, one being that it's a cheaper alternative. The average cost of a cremation ranges between $800 to $2,000, while a traditional burial with a casket, service, viewing, and procession can cost upwards of $10,000. And while burial is often viewed as a more permanent resting place, surprisingly, in some countries, the cemetery plot where you're buried may not be where you remain over the years.
Where we buy a cemetery lot here and you own it forever, in Germany, you rent it. And you rent it usually to start out with for 15 or 20 years. And then after that period of time, if you cannot afford to re-rent it, then the body is exhumed, cremated and put usually in an ossuary. So that's the only real other country that I'm familiar with. Japan, I think their cremation rate is probably 100%, where there are no ground burials.
Wherever you live and whatever option you do choose, Keith says that it is vital to solidify your wishes ahead of time, so less is left up in the air when that day does come.
With monuments, it used to be that you waited until someone had had a death and then you worked with the family on putting up the memorial of their choice. Today, probably 50% of our business in the monument part are people who are together and making their choices while both can see that they're getting what they really want to commemorate their life.
And more people are starting to think ahead. In recent years, Keith has seen an uptick in couples and families coming in to make arrangements.
So I think a monument, to me, and I'm prejudiced, I think it's the most important thing anybody ever does because, as I tell folks, when we die, our house gets sold to somebody else buys our car, we no longer have our boat. The only thing that's left that shows we were here with our name on it is the monument that we placed in the cemetery.
Whether you prefer to be cremated or buried, death is an eventual certainty for each and every person. In many ways, 2020 has exposed the fragility of life. It's always smart to plan ahead and make sure your affairs are in order, so whenever that time does come, your wishes are clear. To find out more about this topic and our guest, John Keith, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can also learn more about Keith's business at keithmonument.com. For more behind the scenes, check out Viewpoints Radio on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
As many as 89% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients are at risk of a complication called cytokine storm, a leading cause of COVID death. But there's good news. Hospitals across the U.S. are enrolling patients in a trial evaluating Lenzilumab, a treatment candidate designed specifically to stop this storm, even with only 1 day of treatment. Dr. Cameron Durant, CEO of Humanigen, the company developing Lenzilumab.
Having a therapeutic that can significantly reduce the time to recovery from COVID-19 and send patients home earlier could dramatically impact the arc of this pandemic.
Participating in the study means access to a potential treatment option in addition to standard of care therapies. Trial participant Mark Baranski shares his experience.
I don't know if I received Lenzilumab or not, but I viewed the trial as doing everything I could for my recovery while contributing to the fight against COVID-19. I certainly encourage others to do the same.
To learn more and find this trial near you, visit StopStorm.com. That's StopStorm.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints. Coming up next week.
We had a number of them that took from 6 to 10 days.
Why is it so historically difficult for Native Americans to vote? Then,
I got up, got my kids ready to get on a computer and had work to do myself, and there's just not enough time in the day.
Our prayers with the people who are parents this year. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.